Kohl, and then Golda, and then Rabin. I think I was the only Israeli government spokesman who holds a PhD from Harvard in Asian Studies. Now, before Hilary will ask questions, I want to make several comments on the film. With your permission, since I'm by training a historian. I'll speak. Is that okay now? Good. There are 5 myths in the film that I would like partly to refute. And you'll understand immediately why. The first, that the war was unavoidable. Golda could have averted the war had she been less rigid, intransigent, inflexible, and all the names that Israelis and others called her. To this very day, there are few in Israel who still feel, who still think that indeed that war could have been prevented, avoided. And my answer to that is very simple, no. And I base this on long discussions with someone who's very close to Sadat, his wife, Jihan. There was a conference years ago, not far from here in San Francisco, she attended, and she said he needed that war in order to redeem the honor of the Egyptian people, the Egyptian army, and his own, after the disaster of the 6-Day War. And his intention essentially was to produce a limited war. He never had any intention of going to Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. This is the first myth. The second, that at some point Israel faced destruction, annihilation. Not true. At no time during the Yom Kippur War did Israel ever face total annihilation. And I'm including the Sinai front and the Syrian front as well. To be honest with you, Israel stopped facing annihilation sometime in 1963, when, according to foreign sources, Israel had access to nuclear weapons. And since then, anyone who talks about the elimination, annihilation, destruction of Israel, not so. Third point. The American airlift. The legend, the myth is that the American airlift saved Israel. It did not. It was very important in terms of morale, but it came after we have stopped the Syrians, pushed them back, occupied additional territory, and at some point with binoculars you could see the outskirts of Damascus. It came, I think, either 13th or 14th of October, a day after the IDF destroyed about 250 Egyptian tanks, and a day before Sharon crossed the Suez Canal. So the concept of we saved you, the airlift saved you, wrong. Another concept which you don't see in this film, that Golda at some point considered suicide. The truth is, when she became prime minister, and I think even when she was foreign minister, she asked the Mossad to give her cyanide pills in case she would be kidnapped or hijacked. But Golda was not a suicidal type. The origin of this idea probably arises from Yiddish. She used the expression "Stab weg," and people said, "Stab weg, I'm going to kill myself." She was not a suicidal part, even only for the fact that she asked herself, assuming I kill myself, who am I leaving this business to? One candidate, Sapir, finance minister didn't want it. Iban was never considered a serious candidate. Dayan they feared. Alon they didn't think was apt. And then she asked herself, Rabin was not yet in the running. Nobody thought of Rabin. Then she asked herself, I've got to find a successor. Another myth, and that is that Dayan lost his nerve. So he had a breakdown. He did not. He was indeed very gloomy. And for a while, certainly the first 2-3 days, spread doom and gloom. The second night of the war, he appeared on television. He used the Hebrew expression, Milchama kivdat damim kivdat yamim. This is a war laden with, it's a long war laden with blood. And the Israelis were terrified because nobody told them the extent of what happened. And many of us were still basking under the enormous victory of the Six-Day War. So here are 5 myths that I think you should dispel yourself from. I'm probably one of 4 or 5 people who was there in the cabinet room when the word came that the Syrians and Egyptians started the war, and you'll never believe the Golda reaction. Somebody came, brought a note. They started the war. Golda said the following in Yiddish, "Nur das fällt mir aus," which means that's all I need. And then she said something in English. They will pay for it. In other words, for her, they started, they have to be punished. Yeah. This is what I wanted initially to get off my chest, and now questions, and I hope that some people here will participate as well.
Well, this is very interesting what you've laid out for us, and very enlightening after we've just seen this film and believe things to be a certain way. And actually, I think the last thing you said is they will pay for this, that she said that was something that was in the film. But talk about what your personal experience was with her during that time. What was it really like to be in the room learning, about what was going on? And the second part of the question is, as her spokesperson and as her press secretary, what did you share? What did you do for your job? What did she allow you to do?
The truth is that most of the war, in terms of serving Golda's spokesman, I was unemployed. I'll tell you why. I went down to Tel Aviv the day before the war and found Golda walking in her office like a caged lioness. News had arrived that the Russians were evacuating civilians from Cairo and Damascus. And she said, what do they know that we don't know? And she then dictated a major policy decision. Israel will not fire the first shot. Israel will not preempt, which was the right decision, but it cost us many, many lives. And off she sent it to Kissinger. It turned out he never received it because he wasn't in New York. Later on in the day, she gathered a number of ministers who were in Tel Aviv. This is all Erev Yom Kippur. The country comes to a total standstill around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And she informed them that things are a bit serious, and they were stunned because they did not know the seriousness of the situation. And this is part of the problem that I had with Golda as spokesman. She was paranoid when it came to secrecy. The less people would know, the better off. If you have time, I'll give you an example. She came in one day from a cabinet meeting, good mood for a change. What happened? They talked about King Hussein. And one minister said Hussein thinks, and the other minister said Hussein wants, and third minister Hussein. What did you say, Golda? I said nothing. Why? Because 2 nights ago I met Hussein. And I knew exactly what he was thinking. She made a commitment to Hussein she would never divulge. And therefore her penchant for secrecy, she paid very heavily for that, and for a spokesman it's a disaster. Friday afternoon she made a condolence call. She allowed the head of the Mossad to go to London to meet his Egyptian informant, who happened to have been son-in-law of Nasser. And he said to her, the moment I hear something, you'll know about it. And we all went back to Jerusalem. And she went back home. Next morning, the informant met the head of Mossad 10 at night until he could get a secure phone and so on. News arrived in Israel about 2 in the morning. Golda was woken up by her military secretary at 4 a.m. Shabbat, Yom Kippur. She was in the office at 6 in the morning. Another major decision, how many people to call up. You don't call up people on Yom Kippur. The chief of staff wanted massive call-up. Dayan wanted minimal. She finally agreed, 200,000. Another major decision, evacuate women and children from the settlements on the Golan Heights. 10 o'clock, the American ambassador arrived. Keating looked at him and said, Mr. Ambassador, we are in trouble. And by then she knew war is imminent. This evening, around 6 o'clock. What we didn't know was that the Egyptians and the Syrians changed the time to 2 o'clock, because at 2 o'clock the sun is in the eyes of the Israeli soldiers on the canal. And therefore, 10 to 2, information came. Sirens were sounded on Yom Kippur, and luckily, Israelis in Yom Kippur either at home or in synagogue. And therefore, the first thing Israelis hear when there's a siren, they open the radio. And later on, she broadcast a message to the nation, which you saw on the film. Galili, her senior advisor, he wrote the speech. I tape recorded twice. And then we taped her message to the nation on television. Why was I unemployed? The next morning, she called me in. By then, I had a pile of requests for interviews from the international media. She said, no interviews, no nothing. And I was stupid enough to argue with her. You don't argue with Golda. Your strength lies in your communicative capability and so on. She said to me in Hebrew, don't you know there's a war on? And that was it. Throughout the war, she appeared once on Israeli television in Hebrew. That was bad. The second appearance was a press conference for the foreign media in English. That was very good. That's her element. The third time was to go to the Knesset on October 15th, and among other things, announced that Israeli IDF forces are now operating on the Egyptian side of the Suez Canal. So basically, I was unemployed, but tell you another story. You saw it on the film. The trip to Sinai and to Egypt. Golda standing at the window of the helicopter. She decided to go to visit Sinai and the troops because 2 days later she was due to go to Washington. She wanted to see herself where the lines are, what's the mood of the troops, listen to the generals. We took off from Tel Aviv. She didn't feel good. And there was a young doctor with us on the flight, and he gave her a shot and she revived, everything is fine. I later on asked him, could you tell me what's your specialization? He said, I'm a gynecologist. That's what a 75-year-old woman needed at the time. But she was good throughout the journey. And then you saw it in the film. She's seated, talking to the troops, a place called Adabia, deep inside Egypt. At the tail end, one soldier got up and shouted in Hebrew, Golda ti chazaka, Golda, be strong. And she looked at him, she said, I don't even have the energy for that. But she did have the energy for that. And although in terms of public relations she was virtually non-existent, she ran the war.
Very interesting. You're revealing a lot of information for us. Tell us about Golda's relationship with her staff during the war.
What Golda did, and again, for some reason, it doesn't appear in the film. They too, I think, she put together a war cabinet. The Israeli government at the time consisted, I think, of about 18 ministers. And she argued if all the ministers would talk, to get something off the agenda would take hours. We don't have time for that. Besides, she liked to work with small groups. So the war cabinet consisted of Golda, the prime minister, chief of staff, Dado, whom she loved, Dayan, whom she did not exactly like, but respected, and two other ministers, Alon and Galili. And they ran the war. Key decisions were brought to the entire cabinet. Key decisions such as Golan first, or we cross the canal, or we accept ceasefire. Look, Golda could be very nice and motherly and warm to the staff, but sometimes she could be not warm. There were a number of people whom she particularly did not exactly like. Some of you remember Abba Iban? Yeah. Not one of her great loves. Iban went around once saying, Golda's vocabulary in Hebrew consists of 500 words. Why does she insist on using only 300? So she stopped saying shalom to him. So he was angry. Why don't you say shalom to him? My vocabulary is so small, why should I waste precious words on you? A year later, she resigned, and we were sitting in our office. Finance minister comes in and says, Golda, did you hear what? Iban, what about him? He wants to be prime minister. And she sat there, she lit a cigarette and said, of which country? In other words, when she had put her mind to it, she could be problematic, but by and large, she looked you in the eye. Never veered. Always looked you in the eye, and she assumed that your reporting was correct, honest, and above all, to the point. In this respect, it was a pleasure to work with her.
Can you tell us about some of the secrets, some of the things that may have been revealed in the film, things that you knew, talk about her illness? Can you address her illness?
I'll address her illness. Golda hated anyone who ever spoke about her illnesses. She had her first heart attack in 48. Cancer was detected in December 65. Cancer of the lymph. It was treated, it was arrested, and she started getting chemotherapy. This, in addition to phlebitis and a few other things. The saying in Israel at the time was any medical student who could enumerate Golda's illnesses would get his degree without exams. But she was very sensitive about this sort of thing. Monday night, she would sneak to Hadassah Hospital, which you saw in the film, through the morgue, a place called the Sharet Institute, Oncology. and she would get her chemo, and next day she would appear with a bandage on her hand, and that's it. During the war, she was not treated at all. And I remember her saying, imagine for a moment someone would find out that the Prime Minister of Israel, in the midst of a terrible war, is being treated for cancer. What would this do to the morale of Israelis? She was not treated during the war. After the war, she almost fell apart. She had shingles and a few other things, and she worked from home. She lived 4 more years. She died in 1978. But during the war, she made sure that no treatment, lest somebody hear about this. Look, there were many other secrets, especially her connections, relations, phone calls to Kissinger. They got along very well. The film tells you that it was Golda and Henry. Never. It was always Mr. Secretary, Madam Prime Minister. Always. There was one incident. We were negotiating the separation of forces agreement with Syria. And Kissinger came back from Damascus. He was very annoyed. I feel like I am a rug merchant in an Oriental bazaar. Very annoyed. She looked at him and said, what do you want from me? I'm an old woman. I was born in the 19th century. And he looked back and smiled and said, Madam Prime Minister, the 19th century is my specialty. But there was a great deal of respect. And eventually, and here, chapeau, I have to take off my hat, Kissinger had a strategy. He knew what he was doing. And if there is a foundation for the peace process that we have now, not only with Egypt, Jordan, with Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, maybe Saudi Arabia, much of it is due to both Golda and Henry Kissinger. Another secret that you wanted to ask. The day we signed the separation of forces agreement with Egypt, the deal was supposed to be signed at 11 in the morning. Kissinger came at 6 a.m. from Egypt, from Aswan. And he brought with him a letter from Sadat. Not to the Prime Minister of the Zionist entity or the Jewish state and so on. Prime Minister of State of Israel. Prime Minister, I'm hopeful that this new chapter is going to be open, and through Kissinger it will move forward. And she looked at the letter, instead of saying this wonderful good news and so on, she looked at Kissinger and said, how'd you get it? And he said, yesterday I was in Aswan, and Sadat said to me, you tell the old lady in Jerusalem so and so. And he said to him, why should I tell her? Dictate a letter, sign it, I'll take it. This, in many respects, symbolized the beginning of a new hope. Now, this is Sadat who launched the war against us, causing Israel 2,653 dead in the Yom Kippur War. But she understood in her instincts that something has changed. And this time her instincts were right, as they were right on the eve of the Yom Kippur War.
Can I ask a question?
Not yet. Sorry. Hold your questions, please. Watching this film, what did it bring up for you? Were there any particular moments?
Many, many moments that we were there, some of them close to despair, especially the second day when we failed with the counter-attack. One thing I was asked, and I want to stress here, I never saw Golda cry during that war. And there was a lot to cry about. In fact, she herself said that she cried once when she signed the Declaration of Independence, And she later said that there were tears in her eyes when she met the pilots who brought in the first American airlift. I saw Golda cry bitterly, weep. On a totally different occasion, if you still have the energy to listen to it, I'll tell you. It had to do with German-Israel relations. Golda hated the Germans and the German people, and she knew how to hate. 1965, we had to deal with the Germans. They would deliver to Israel American-made tanks, so that the Johnson administration would not be accused of becoming Israel's major arms supplier. The whole thing hinged on secrecy. There was an accident, a tank carrier turned over. It was blown, and the Arabs threatened the Germans, stop this right now. Germany said, okay. And the Germans came to us and said, diplomatic relations. We said, fine. This is 65, 20 years after the Holocaust. On a number of occasions, Golda was foreign minister. I remember her saying, if and when the German ambassador presents his credentials in Israel, I hope that either I'll be dead, sick, or out of Israel. But she was alive and well and in Israel. The date, it was August 1965, a hot Jerusalem day. I arrived early with a group of German journalists. I was then head of government press office. I had to look after German reporters. Many of them came. Historic day. Israel and Germany are establishing diplomatic relations. On this occasion, there's either a police or military band to play the national anthems, and there's a guard of honor. We positioned ourselves next to the police band. And I look carefully and I see on the arm of the trumpeter, one of the trumpeters, blue numbers, which means that he survived Auschwitz. The ambassador arrived and they started playing the German national anthem, and he was playing and he was crying. He was playing and the tears came running down his cheek. Ceremony over, I walk back to the residence. Golda is still there. Bohena, come over. What happened? And I told her, and she cried. Wow. And I suppose with good reason. But as she said, tears doesn't go together with wars.
That's interesting. We know that there were recently archives were opened that revealed many truths about Golda. How do you think that this film changes her image, number one?
Yeah.
And what do you think, along the same thing, how do you think that you helped to rehabilitate her image in your talks?
I'll answer it in the following fashion. Preceding Golda, we had a prime minister called Levi Eshkol. He was a wonderful man, probably among the best prime minister we ever had. Fabulous sense of humor, all in Yiddish. And when he talked about Golda, he had 3 words for her. When he admired her, he used to call her the queen, die Malke. When he was a bit annoyed, it was the klafte, the shoe. When he was very angry, it was the machashefa, the witch. For years, already at the time when she was prime minister, and certainly after, Golda was the queen of Israel, queen of the Jews overseas, especially here in this country. For many Israelis, 2 other were more apt. Israelis argued that she was rigid, inflexible, intransigent, didn't understand, poorly educated, all sorts of epithets. And therefore, the image of Golda in Israel was, by and large, negative in some respects to this very day. Golda knew about it, and she was partly responsible for this negative image because of her madness for secrecy. And on many occasions she said, one day the archives will be open and then you'll see what I've done. Trouble is that archives in Israel, diplomatic documents, 30 years. Mossad, 40 years or 50 years, army, 50 years. So we had to wait until recently for more documents to come out. I did a bio of Golda, one of the first 1990, then I revised it, 2008 I think. And I tried to change the image, I hope a bit successfully. Since the documents are now out, 2 books have come out recently in Hebrew on Golda's efforts to prevent war, what she tried to do, feelers to Sadat and so on. And they've been very important. This film is another layer in the effort to rehabilitate Golda's image and to put it in, finally, and rightly so, the proper perspective. And this is why this film is difficult. I was involved in it quite extensively. And in case you're not aware, at some point Golda says, get me Medzini to write me a speech. Yeah. So I'm Medzini and I didn't write her a speech. I used to write messages and not speeches. And therefore, Golda's image in Israel is now finally changing, and I think all to the better.
Question about Helen's performance. So did you have any contact with Helen?
No, none at all. I had contact with the director. My son, who is here with me, who happens to be a tour guide, he was able to arrange for the man in charge of scenery to visit the office from where Golda conducted the war. It's inside the Defense Ministry perimeter. It's now a museum. Ben-Gurion was there. Shkol ran the 6-Day War from there. Golda ran the Yom Kippur War. So he was involved with the man with the scenarios. I was involved with the script writer, came to see me, and 10, 12, a bit more hours with Guy Nativ, the director, most on Zoom. I was in Jerusalem, and he was decent enough. He said, look, I know the history. I don't know Golda. I said, I'll help you. Her mannerism, how she operated, 2 packs a day of cigarettes, endless cups of coffee, certain expressions, calm, collected, cool, full control of the situation. An amazing thing to watch, and therefore the film in many respects is good for her, and I'm personally extremely annoyed when I read some Jewish groups say that Golda should have been played by a Jewish actress, which is nonsense. She did a first-class job. You're aware that she had to, the makeup took 3 hours. 3 in the morning she would get up. It was shot in London, and then I think 3 hours to take it off. She knew the mannerism, the slouch, the expression, as one who was there. I can vouch, I can tell you that excellent, excellent performance. Unlike 2 others who tried their hand at Golda. One was Ingrid Bergman years ago, a disaster, and the other was Anne Bancroft, a greater disaster. But Meron, to be fair, a woman in New York called Tova Feldshaw. She did a one woman show, and that was good. That was good.
Can you talk about some of, before we open it up for the audience, can you talk about some of her accomplishments?
I would list the following: raising funds for weapons here in 48, $100 million, which today pays barely for 2 planes. Then it was a fortune that enabled us to buy equipment in Czechoslovakia, with which we won the war. The second, a massive attention and series of labor laws, which are with us to this very day: child work, women's work, day of rest, holidays, paid holidays, but 10 of them, which is the foundation of our legal basis for working men, women, children. The third, Russian Jews. She was sent to Moscow as not ambassador, minister, plenipotentiary. She was there 8 months. She met Russian Jews 3 times in synagogue. And she lit the spark that eventually became the flame that eventually brought us 1.5 million Russians, and they revolutionized Israel. Another very important achievement was relations with Kennedy. There's a lot of talk about Israel-American relations, and I read often 75 years friendship and love and whatnot. Wrong. We had serious problems with Truman, although he recognized Israel. We had huge problems with Eisenhower, especially Dulles. Things changed when Kennedy came in, for a variety of reasons. We don't have time to go into it. And then he developed a very good relationship with Lyndon Johnson. I don't think she worked with, and of course Nixon. Certainly. Ford, nothing. She met Carter once, and very reluctantly, and the one who insisted that she sees Carter was Rabin. Rabin said to her, this man could become president of the United States, which he did. And at that summer, another senator came from this country. What's your name? Joe Biden. And they had a very good meeting. She had no contact with Carter. The only contact indirectly. The story went around that when she died, Carter sent Air Force One with a big delegation of congressmen and senators and governors and Kissinger. It was headed by his mother, Ms. Lillian, who was a bit advanced in age. And the rumor at the time, I'm not responsible if it's true or not, it's a nice story. At the end of the funeral, somebody heard Ms. Lillian say, I didn't know Golda was Jewish.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
About Nixon?
Go ahead.
I believe in that play that you referenced. Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to hear you. That there was an inference that Golda implied to Nixon that she would use a nuclear weapon if he didn't send weapons. Is there any truth?
No
to that?
way, no way.
Yeah.
The story is this. Third year of the war. Counteroffensive in Sinai failed. We were doing badly on Golan. There was a meeting, a small meeting in the office of the Prime Minister, in which Dayan proposed a deep withdrawal, which shocked everybody. Nobody was prepared. And at the last moment, one of the ministers, Galili, said, let's wait until the chief of staff comes back from Sinai. We'll hear him and then we'll see what happens. Eventually, it was not carried out. As the meeting was breaking up, Dayan leaned on the door and said, maybe we should consider utilizing special measures. And Golda looked him in the eye and said in Hebrew, Tishkach mizeh, forget it. End of story.
Yes, we have another question. If you can stand up so that everybody can hear your question, that'd be great.
Can you explain the listening device and
Yes.
why it was off and who was to blame and was there some intrigue in there?
Yeah, the question was, Israel installed listening device on the Egyptian side of the canal, long before the war. Among those who was involved in it is later Chief of Staff, Prime Minister Ed Barak. And these listening devices would enable us to hear and sense and smell and feel any outstanding military action. The responsibility for employing and using the device was in the hands of the Director of Military Intelligence, General Eli Zeira. He, at some point, gave the order, don't do it. He feared that they would be discovered, and the cost would be enormous. And therefore he gave the order not to utilize at the crucial time. But we had intelligence from others. Look, our problem was not knowing where they were. Our problem was understanding, interpreting, intent, capability, determination. Would they have the guts to do it? Many Israelis said they won't. And we were wrong.
Yes, we have a question right here.
Yeah, I had at the beginning of the movie, they used the word hubris to talk about the Israelis feeling that after the 6 Days War, the Arabs wouldn't attack. And I had an experience. I was taking a class at the Hebrew University. My major was Islamic history and Hebrew and Arabic. And Amnon Cohen was my professor. I came back from Lebanon and Syria from a Passover visit, and I said, the Arabs want to attack us. And he said, oh no, not at all, they're scared of us. And that was about a year before the Yom Kippur War. So I don't know, that was like just sort of an anecdotal thing, but I don't know whether that hubris that was talked about really was
Very much there. By the way, Amnon Cohen, your professor, was my tennis partner. Hubris, very much there. We thought we were on top of the world.
Yeah.
We're the greatest power between Morocco and Iran. And we paid very heavily for that. We take one more, and then I want to leave you with the following idea after the last
Yes.
question.
There's a question in the middle.
Yeah, thank you for making the trip, and thank you for making the trip. So Sleven, there's 120. She looked to be 120, sir.
Amen.
What do you think Golda, if she was alive today, in your speculation and best estimation, what would she think about the current geopolitical climate, United States climate?
I prefer not to answer that. But I assume you are the last question, am I correct, or we still have time?
Maybe another question.
Right.
One more.
Not one more, and then I'll explain why I say that.
You have a question?
Yeah, actually, as a child, I grew up in Iran, and I had a different picture of Dayan, Moshe Dayan, and I feel like this movie changed the whole thing because Moshe Dayan in Iran was a huge, big hero for everybody. Everybody was when it comes to talking about someone strong, it was Moshe Dayan, and they use his name. But this movie kind of
Okay, did anybody hear what he said in the back?
The question
Okay.
was about, did the movie do justice to Moshe Dayan?
Yeah.
My answer is yes. He, at some point, fell apart, recovered. I saw him every second day. He recovered. However, the conduct of the war was taken away from him. by the creation of the inner cabinet, the war cabinet, which unfortunately is not mentioned in the film.
So did he actually was the one that suggested a nuclear weapon to Golda
The
Meir?
story is that he hinted over the need, maybe we should consider it, yes. The only one.
You wanted to tell your piece. You wanted to tell your story now.
I assume there are no more questions. I want to leave you with the following idea. I've been here for the last 2 weeks, and as you can imagine, I was born in Israel, grew up in Israel, went through 5 wars, 6 wars, 4 children, 10 grandchildren, lived to see from Palestine to Israel. And I've been asked by many, what's happening, what's going on there? I will not go into discussion. However, we are going through an extremely difficult patch, the likes of which we have never even imagined was possible, because the threat is domestic, not foreign. I can assure you, however, that we will overcome this. However, we are already bruised, scarred, scathed, but we'll find a way to deal with this. In the meantime, I plead with you, don't abandon us, don't leave us. Even if for the following reason, which I'll illustrate with a story, a true story. I suppose many of you remember the rescue of Israeli and Jewish passengers from Entebbe, 1976. For those who don't remember, Air France plane hijacked on a flight from Tel Aviv to Paris out of Athens, German Palestinian terrorists brought to Libya and then to Entebbe. Captain was a Goy, a non-Jew, Captain Baku. At some point, there was a selection. Jews here, non-Jews here. Now, selection is a word that we remembered from the Holocaust. Baku went with the Jewish passengers, saying, "Je suis le commandant, je suis responsable." I'm the commander, I'm responsible. I think the selection, more than anything else, finally determined Rabin's decision to go for a military option. I remember he prepared 2 letters, one praising the army, the other a letter of resignation if something would have gone wrong. Anyhow, operation succeeded, and Baku arrived with the Jewish passengers, greeted as a big hero, which he was. And we said to him, stay and have a holiday, enjoy yourself and so on. No, I'm going back to Paris tomorrow, resume my business, and next day he goes back to Paris. And he arrives and he's interviewed by the French news channels. And one interview is broadcast in Israel that evening. I'm at home with my wife and my children. My son was then 11. And we're watching. Question, Captain, can you tell us what happened? He said, you know, we didn't exactly go through customs and immigration. Okay? Next question. Captain, were you sure the Israelis would come for you? Answer, without batting an eyelash, 3 words in French. Mais qui d'autre? But who else? I looked at my family, said, I've been listening to Zionist speeches all my life. This was the shortest, this was the bit he understood. And therefore, friends, when the chips are down and the crunch is big, It's you here in California, it's us there in Jerusalem, it's us in Jerusalem, you in California, there's no one else.
Vicky Dole.
Shana Tova, good night to you.